Welcome to Desire Lines, my research podcast. Today we are welcoming Dr. Tamara Russell to the podcast. Tamara is known as Tamara, 2 PhDs and a black belt Russell. She's a multidisciplinary practitioner, drawing on clinical psychology, neuroscience, martial arts, and mindfulness. Tamara works as an academic and clinician, exploring the use of embodied mindfulness in the work of transformation and self-development. Tamara is involved in international collaborations looking at how mindfulness training changes the structure and function of the brain. She's a director of innovation think tank, the Mindfulness Centre of Excellence in London, and she's a visiting lecturer at King's College London and also the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience. Tamara is also the author of 3 books, Mindfulness in Motion, What is Mindfulness, and What Colour is Your Dragon? Hi, Tamara. Welcome.
Thank you, Emily. Great to be here, and thank you for that introduction.
Fantastic. How are you today?
Well, I'm good. I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I just came back from a nice run to loosen up my neural networks and my body, and try to make sure I've got a fresh perspective here today for our conversation.
Fantastic. I've been gardening today to I do the same thing, getting my hands in some soil. We have spoken a little bit before this, where I introduced you to my research, and listeners will be a little bit familiar. But essentially, I'm exploring the concept of desire lines as a guiding metaphor, meaning the intuitive tracks that we take in life, and these little pathways you see in the grass. It's also used a lot in urban settings. So a path taken by intuition, which I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with. And we're going to start today. You work a lot with pathways in the brain.
Yes.
Obviously, as a neuroscientist and mindfulness practitioner, and also as a martial artist. We spoke some weeks ago about as we linking the concept of desire lines to those pathways in the brain as a metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I can give a little bit of a framework, trying not to go kind of too much into the technical detail. But I suppose perhaps the listeners may be familiar with the language or the concept of neuroplasticity. And this is the capacity that our brain has to create new pathways, but also to prune back pathways that are no longer being used. And what I'm fascinated in as a neuroscientist is, firstly, how neuroplasticity develops over the lifespan. We think about children as these multi-potential brains and beings, but over time, the pathways of the brain and the synaptic firing goes again and again and again and strengthens certain pathways, which then become habits and patterns, which then become much more automatic in terms of driving our thinking and behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, if we don't exercise our brain and keep it nice and flexible, just like we do our body, as we age, those grooves get deeper and deeper. And maybe you know somebody in your life who's an older adult, and you might get frustrated with them a little bit because they're quite rigid. We describe them as quite rigid and inflexible in their thinking. And this quite likely does represent grooves that have just deepened and deepened in the neural networks and the neural architecture, which makes it quite difficult to be flexible. So what I'm interested in my work is, how do we maintain that flexibility and multi-potentiality throughout the lifespan, and ultimately have the curiosity and openness of a child combined with the wisdom of experience, that peak combination.
And you look at this, quite recently, your work focuses on the attention network, isn't it? Which I will speak a little bit later about, having done your recent course in Focus.
Yes.
Where you teach about the attention network and those pathways and how to improve that plasticity. Is that something you find as a martial artist, as well as in your mindfulness work. Obviously, the two are sort of intrinsically linked for you. But how do your various practices contribute to the finding the sort of ease of navigation around those different pathways?
Well, I loved that. I loved that definition that you gave, a path taken with intuition. And linking that back to the attention network, I suppose when I'm thinking about attuning to intuition and the subtle signals of intuition, this requires an attention network that's able to listen and sense and feel into. I suppose there I'm talking more about the internal mind's eye attention system, perhaps more so than the visual system or the auditory system. But there may be clues in the environment that we pick up on, that our brain processes, that resonates with an intuitive response, that leads us to like go left rather than right, or do this rather than that. And I suppose that is always fascinating. How do we make those choices? And I was reflecting on that coming into this interview, my own experience. And I kind of was laughing a bit because my interest in training attention, I think, comes from the difficulties that I've had paying attention and not being so distracted. So I was thinking, well, what led me to those choices? And some of it was just rampant impulsiveness and desire for stimulation. And so I feel there's some balance that we can come to, depending on our starting point, around that desire to just explore, which can sometimes be without discernment, just I've been everywhere, I've done everything, I wasn't even thinking, I just wanted to be in the world and be stimulated. That's one kind of desire. But I'm not sure that's the same as the desire that might come from like more subtle sensing of like, it feels I'm sort of making a movement with my hands for those that are listening. It's got more of that subtle kind of flavor of tilting one way rather than that just charging forwards to get as much sensory stimulation as you can get.
Absolutely. And we'll come back to pathways a lot in the later part of this podcast, because I really want to touch on the environmental aspects of that. But we've spoken about neurodiversity a lot and ADHD and those pathways. And I am very much going with the term neurodivergence being accurate, because our brains do physically diverge. And if we could all have brain scans, it would be so interesting to illuminate how our individual neural pathways are working. That your work is really looking at supporting people who struggle to focus or over focus for a variety of reasons, and maybe adjusting some of those habits and helping people make different sorts of choices for themselves.
Well, I would say, just to say, I'm aware I didn't answer that martial arts question. I won't move to that. But for me, I feel it's more about how can we be interested and get curious about the way in which our attention moves, and be more open to the fact that there's a greater variety of experience of that than we perhaps initially thought. I'm not a huge fan of giving labels, because I think there can sometimes be a relief from a label, but there can also be a kind of laziness that comes from a label, and it still divides. There's a neurotypical, there's a neurodivergent, and I would say, no, we're just brains that have attention networks, and there's a big variety in how we use those and what our preferences are. And some of it may be genetically determined. Some of it, as a psychologist, of course, I would say some of it is determined by not only our environments, but our emotional environments, because emotions and attention are highly interconnected at the neural level. And I think that, my own reflections on my own experiences, I remember once my Kung Fu teacher said, what is it you're running away from? So there's that's a bit more of an old-fashioned view of manic defense, hyperactivity in some cases is the fallout of being in emotional environments where emotions were not allowed to be expressed. And then the energy of that goes into the motor system and comes out as hyperkinetic and hyperactive physical behaviors. Some people experience that more in the mental movements.
And so it's really hard, isn't it?
It's like, how can we study it? How can we study it? How can we talk about it? How can we be interested and say, wow, like, look at your mind. I didn't even see that. That didn't even get on my radar, but your attention picked that up. Isn't that amazing? And together, look at all the knowledge we can get together.
Yeah, I love shared group experiences that are about paying attention, because everybody notices such different things. And I think it could be really illuminating as well. It's tricky with neurodivergence to show that things may not actually be how we are and how we might say, because there's some things maybe we can't change and we'll always have to work with. But it's quite a fine line and quite challenging in today's culture, I think, to say, hey, you might actually be able to change some of those pathways.
Well, and when I've been, what I suppose from a mindfulness point of view, there's two key elements. One is the compassion and the self-compassion, which in and of itself can really change one's experience, whether you've got a diagnosis or not. But if we are talking about something like ADHD, one of the things that really comes up is shame. And a life of being different, a life of feeling that you've got the wrong end of the stick, or that you didn't understand, or people are always worried that you're going to break something or burn the house down, or these kind of narratives that get embedded, and
or that over self-consciousness, or being the person who stands out or does things differently, or even if that's taken in a light-hearted way within the family or the social group.
Yeah. So the piece there is around shame, and certainly when you go in to offer attention training practices to people with ADHD, the first thing they do is fail horrendously. So and so I think working with how I've worked with that myself and with my clients is I call it fast failing. And in the business world, this is like a real plus. Fast failing is like the route to innovation and new thinking and new knowledge and new products. So I really feel that how I've come at the attention training aspect of mindfulness is becoming really interested and studying at a deep level all the mindlessness, all the distractions. And that meant, first of all, accepting that was what was going on, and then loving it and being kind and being curious and saying, right, if I study all these ways that I'm not present, that principle of yin and yang, I kind of tipped over into an understanding of what it means to be mindful. But it doesn't mean that I'm now magically able to do mindfulness or to be present. It's just I notice more quickly when I'm distracted. I've got some more techniques to get back. I know when I should try to be more present and when I should just allow my brain to do what it wants to do, because that's a kind of thing. I've studied, what's the time of day when I'm good? What are the situations that make me better or worse in terms of paying attention? And these are skills for anybody, really. I really don't think these are just for people with ADHD. I think everybody could benefit from this.
Absolutely. And I'm researching at the moment nature and neurodivergence. And there's actually less on the autism front and nature research than there is for ADHD. Then obviously these things cross over. But I wanted to reference Luke Bearden, who wrote Avoiding Anxiety in Autistic Adults, and also a book about autistic children. And his thing, the big takeaway I took from his work was autism plus environment equals outcome.
Interesting.
So people are so very affected by the sensory world, and sensory seeking. It's also another thing I'm looking at as a form, I think, of finding those pathways, because we get drawn to those things, a lot of people, neurodivergent or not, that fulfill us on a sensory level.
Well, and movement is part of that. I mean, and the movement that comes from the sensations that come from movement, the sensations that come from maybe in the martial arts, learning a sequence, perfecting a sequence, streamlining a sequence. I suppose what I really loved about the martial arts was you do get rewarded very quickly with it. It's hard at the beginning, but if you practice and you repeat, you will get better. It's that's the only way you can go. You're not going to be Bruce Lee, but you definitely will improve. You definitely will get faster, fluider, smoother, be able to do it, with less huffing and puffing.
Oh, absolutely. I'm taking some boxercise classes recently, and it's like coordination boot camp. It really, left and right is very challenging for me sometimes. So it does, but it gets better. And those patterns like dance. I really enjoy dance and practice and teach yoga as well. And we talked about, in our chat we had the other week, forest schools and outdoor learning, and how important that is for building different sorts of neural pathways.
Yeah, one of the things I like to do when I'm out in nature is, I'm inspired by the ways in which nature finds its way. Because it's so varied. The movements of nature kind of inspire thinking about different mental movements in different ways. And some of the retreats and things that I've done, we've done them aligned to the seasons, because the seasons have different energetic movements and can be a guide. Is it the expanding energy of summer? Is it the kind of sinking and mulching energy of winter? And how can we align with those energetic aspects? And I guess in our modern world, we've become quite removed from that, because we've got light and power, and we have the lights on till 10 o'clock at night in the winter or whatever. But in our ancestors' times, we probably were a bit more attuned to some of those cycles, mainly due to light, I suppose.
Absolutely. I just read quite a lot about dark skies and the whole dark skies movement, which we have one in North Wales, which is great, and Anglesey as well, I believe. And I mean, personally, I started observing the Sabbats, all of them. So it's the Celtic Wheel and the festivals, because it's every few weeks, and it gives you a chance to refocus and tap into that energy of the seasons. And I think it's important at each of those kind of turning of the year as well to select what you want to focus on and kind of refocus your energy, because it's very easy to get overwhelmed, say in summer, and possibly go down all sorts of pathways that might not serve us. And then get frazzled and burnt out and overwhelmed.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about that point about what's happening when we put kids in school in the forest, or what's happening when we work with our bodies, or we work in certain environments. And I mean, for me, I like this 4E cognition framework. So I've just looked this up just to remember what the 4Es are. Embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. And, the highlight of this, I suppose, is our consciousness extends beyond our body, and our consciousness is interacting all the time with the environments around us. So, I mean, a really basic piece of research was something like work done in hospitals, where they showed that people who were in a hospital room that had a window and a plant, or a window where they could see green, got better quicker. And I mean, this is informing, I think, urban design as well. But if, how would we design environments if we understood that? And I wonder if it is the case that there are people in that category of neurodivergent who are leading the way in helping us to really understand. For them, it's just very extreme because they're so sensitive to the external environment. But I believe that it's a continuum. So we are all with this sensitivity. We're just not aware of it, and it doesn't impact us, or we can filter it out in some way. But the 4E cognition, I think, would say, no, fundamentally, this is for all of us. But those with autism particularly, so sensitive to the environmental sensations.
Absolutely. And that really connects to, I think it's Kaplan, the attention restoration theory, which is, it's some years old now, but being picked up a lot in new accessibility guidelines around the outdoors and nature. And I think one of the things we wanted to speak about was, just turn back at my notes. We wanted to talk about how the trained ADHD brain can save the world.
Yay!
Yay!
Well, the topic, can the trained ADHD brain save the world? I think there's a few qualities of the ADHD brain which we need now, and some of it is the impulsivity, because we live in this in some parts of society, quite risk averse. In other parts, we totally need to be more risk averse. But in some parts of society, I think we're quite risk averse. There's a lot of worries about doing things differently. There is this rigidity and stuckness in the neural pathways. This is how we do things. And I think the impulsivity of the ADHD brain can sort of bust through that sometimes. And it's not always thoughtful. But if we have a trained ADHD brain that can use the power of the impulsivity combined with intentionality, and maybe that intentionality that's placed in the bigger why, which is we need to do things differently because what we're doing now is harming, what we're doing now isn't working. I don't know what the outcome looks like, but we need fast, and we need blasting through, and we need the willingness to get it wrong in the service of 100 wrongs will lead to 101, which is the right. I mean, Dyson famously said this in his development of the vacuum cleaner. He said, I had to make 100 designs that weren't the right thing because it was 101 that was. So if you've got an ADHD that's got that impulse, that power, that kind of slightly I don't care what people think, combined with I'm okay to make mistakes. I'm like an expert at making mistakes, and mistakes is how we learn, and we got to learn fast, and we got to fail fast. And it's that, sometimes they call it galaxy mind, ADHD galaxy mind. People say, I can see this vision, but I can't always articulate it, and I definitely can't execute. Those are the frustrations I feel. It's like, I can see it, I can feel it. I know it's right, but I can't articulate it, and I can't execute because I have to execute it in this world that asks me to do all these things that I really struggle with.
But then there are other people who can do that. And I think loads of major breakthroughs would not have happened unless the person, some oddball with brightly coloured trousers, came jumping in and said, hey guys, let's try this instead. And then all the techie types make it happen. Is that the upside of the impulsive ADHD brain, but also the stubbornness of the autistic brain?
Yes.
Who is like, this is my idea, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is exactly how I'm going to do it. And
yes. Well, and we could call that perseverance, maybe.
Yes, maybe not stubbornness or sticking to your values, or but then obviously there's an awareness side with that as well, to sort of look at the focus and think about your intentions, and then select what your intentions might be with and which ones to follow through on is, I think, a good thing, which your work in Focus very much helps with. Would you like to say a little bit about the course on focusing? And we'll come back to it at the end. I'll put the information in the show notes as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think what sort of transformed my work, my understanding of my own mind and brain, and the work I was doing teaching mindfulness, particularly teaching mindfulness to people that can't do mindfulness, was this 4-stage model of mindfulness that comes from a piece of neuroimaging research. And focusing is only one part of it. But as I mentioned before, the way that I help people to study focus is also by teaching them where they're at when they're not focusing. So we're interested in both attention and inattention, and where am I when my mind is not where I asked it to be. And when we get into that exploration, we can discover more about our attention network and what works for us, and we can slowly, gently find our way to train it. We can become interested in the wandering mind and all its amazing features, as well as the way it traps us sometimes. We can begin to learn about the salience network, the network that reminds us that we're not doing what we thought we were supposed to be doing and that we've gone off track. And the all-important intentions, the power of intentions to hold us on task. And for me, I use verbal intentions to really, come on, Tamara's brain, just on the breath, just on the breath. All you need to do now is, I'm kind of like doing verbal chat to help me stay on track. So it's sort of like, I call it CrossFit for the brain, and the attention and the focus is one part of it. But of course, the more we learn about distraction, the more we can learn about focus as well.
I really enjoyed doing it. I think I'm going to do it again.
Yeah, great.
As well, because you have options for self-learning, don't you? And then people can also join a live Wednesday class. There's different tiers and options that they can join.
Yeah, so there's the self-paced with the app and, loads of content in there. Some embodied learning using 4 cognition methods to help with the learning. And then the Wednesday drop-in is the place if people want to be more, in a group with community, people practicing and be able to ask questions. Yeah.
Great. So we'll put all those details of how people can find out more about that in the show notes.
Great.
Let's just pop back to that sort of, I suppose, instinct or impulsive instinct that we find a lot in neurodivergence, and creativity as well, just creatives in general. We spoke when we were chatting before this podcast about the desire lines metaphor, and thinking about, I think you mentioned the deer in the fields, in the park, and the tracks that they make. And we spoke about the human versus animal decision making and intuition. So, we think of desire lines as just a path we've intuitively followed without thinking about it, but there's not an animal language for that. It's just happening. So I was thinking about the spontaneity of that, and then, which I think he also touches on walking and nature connection as a form of creating these new pathways.
Yeah, and you could, I'm just sort of trying to think from my own perspective there a little bit. It's why do we make the choices that we make? How conscious are we of the routes that we take, whether it's a career route or a walking route on the way to work? And I suppose I'm imagining, how do we choose our way to work? Well, we're very functional in our choices, aren't we? I want the quickest route. And I remember sort of teaching mindfulness, and one of the suggestions was, is there another route that may not be the quickest, but is more nourishing for you? The route where you get off the bus and walk through the park for the final part, or, just trying to think about how we move through our environments rather than the lens of efficiency, with the lens of what will create the best conditions for my body and mind for when I arrive at work. But it may take longer, and then we're like fighting because, the brain is saying, oh my God, I haven't got time. But if you arrive in a calmer and more centered and open and focused way, the benefits may be different than if you were like huffing and puffing and on the commuter train and elbows and nose under somebody's armpit and just getting really agitated before you arrive at the office. That's a little bit different than the question you asked, but it's how do we choose our paths? How do we choose our pacing?
And maintain that if you have to do something new. So an illustration is my current desire is to take part in such events that I might speak at or give a talk or travel to, which I do sometimes, and I make a fairly good job of it, I think and hope. But the run-up and the aftermath to those things is often still fragmented and very frazzled, especially afterwards. And so really working with, and this is, I'm quite early on, I'd say, in working with a lot of these nervous system practices, even though I've been doing yoga for years, it's been quite recent that I've touched into things like deeper somatics, breath work, the sort of things that you're teaching nowadays. We worked together quite a few years ago.
Yeah.
And so it's such a journey, isn't it? And so I'm going to be aware of that at my next event, how to really be speaking and presenting and sharing from that nourished, spacious place, even though it's a new pathway I've taken, and that throws up various challenges. I think a lot of people feel like that these days, especially after the pandemic. We're all navigating a slightly different world.
Well, and it's how do we, as you're talking, I'm thinking of the kind of Jungian like maps of the mind. We're using this language of navigation and maybe sort of maps and new territories, whether they're internal or external. And I think where the mindfulness, one aspect of mindfulness that can be really helpful there is, it's not so much the attention part of mindfulness, but it's more the attitudinal foundations. And, my version of that is the 3 C's: courage, curiosity, and compassion. Sometimes I need all 3. Sometimes one sort of jumps out as the one that may be more helpful in a situation where there's newness or uncertainty. So that gives me a sense of confidence, even in a situation where I don't know and I might be getting provoked in some way. I find a confidence and a spine in choosing the way in which I will approach the situation. So even if the situation is bringing uncertainty and, panic or fear, I'm like, okay, but I'm going to be compassionate with my fear. I'm going to be curious about it. I'm going to have the courage to stay with it in the service of I'm exploring. And there's something in that language of exploring, and maybe there's some individual differences there, in one's desire to explore, one's desire for exploring the environment and getting the sensory feedback that comes from new environments.
Absolutely. And you might have that desire, but if those other pathways aren't nourished, it can be a bit of a getting experience of being slightly lost and trying to kind of read new environments. And I wanted to go back to sort of touch on the idea of getting lost, actually, because we're talking about focus a lot and getting lost, and desire lines is exploring new places, maybe involves a bit of getting lost, which isn't a bad thing. And I was going to reference Rebecca Solnit's A Field Guide to Getting Lost, which is a really beautiful book. And she tells us that the word lost comes from the Old Norse los, meaning the disbanding of an army, which suggests, she writes, soldiers falling out of formation to go home, which I think really sort of says a lot. And sometimes if you could just relax into that process of being a bit lost, yet hanging on to your internal compass and navigation, it's de-armoring comes to mind, which is a whole embodied topic.
Well, I'm reminded of one of my great Brazilian colleagues, Mateus Romero, who's part of our teaching team of mindfulness teacher training in Brazil. And we say this, his famous line to the students that he even uses the English, enjoy being lost. Because there's that, as we begin to turn the camera in, as we begin to develop the mindfulness skills of orienting to our experience in a very particular way, we will be lost at times. We will be confused. It's a process. It's a spiral. It's not a linear journey. We're going to go round and round and round. And again, I sometimes think like, oh, how lucky I am, because this is my experience of the ADHD mind. It took me quite a long time to realize, but I realized that I just loop, and I know it's frustrating sometimes for people around me, because they're like, why are you not learning? Why are you just doing the same thing again? Like, you've got the awareness, you've had the experience, you've got the awareness, you are able to articulate it, but you still do the same thing.
That spiral is part of it, and maybe we do the same thing, but we're doing it in a different way and taking it somewhere. And
we're learning and we're failing different aspects of it. I realize that I'm spiraling, but each time I spiral, I'm learning something new. But the reality is that when I do finally get to the learning, I'm extremely confident. And I think that sometimes also puts people off, because they're thinking, well, how does she, she's a bit arrogant. What is she talking about? How can she be so sure? And I realized afterwards, I am sure because I've been round like 500 times in a really embodied way. And I had this sort of moment where we use this language quite flippantly sometimes, but it really sort of hit me like, well, they call ADHD, a learning difficulty. It's classified, psychologically as a learning difficulty. And we could get in a hump about that and say, oh, it's not fair, it's not. But I had this real sort of aha moment where I was like, oh, right. Yes, it's because I need to learn in this way, right? I need to learn in this spiral way.
And that's seen as a difficulty is a shame, I feel, and says a lot.
It's just a difference, isn't it?
It's a different learning. I like learning difference, or specific learning needs rather than difficulty, because a lot of people don't have difficulty learning. They might have some things, yes, but other things incredibly quick. And we spoke.
But then I feel sorry for them, because then they stop exploring, right?
Exactly. Like stop. Another great book is, Temple Grandin.
Yes, I love this.
The Power of the Autistic Brain, Minds That Think Differently, and she's a great advocate for all of that. We did speak a while ago about these spirals and different sorts of networks and different ways of creating networks, possibly as a more feminine way of looking at things. And it is hard to make distinctions between the feminine and masculine, I feel, in today's gender conversations, and quite rightly so, because we value the non-binary and thinking about things away from gender. I love, but I also personally honor still the ideas of the feminine and masculine, and obviously we have both within us all the time. So I think we need the fluidity and the polarity. Personally, I know that's not everybody's view.
When I with the 4-stage model that I teach in the focus course, I did a presentation in the workplace about, I called it the yin and yang of attention. And recognizing that this is an area fraught with opinions and changing ideas, but for the purposes of exploration, pointing out that there are some, quote unquote, gender differences in how the attention network is shaped and utilized. And I gave, for example, this idea that we could call it the more yang, the more masculine style of attention can be that hyper focus that doesn't allow anything else in. And a lot of the men who were working in this setting recognized that they can sit down at the computer and before they know it, it's 10 p.m. and their wives and children and partners have not crossed their minds once in that time. And they're very surprised to open their phones and see there's 15 missed calls from their partners and their kids saying, when are you coming home for dinner or whatever. And the opposite of that might be the more yin focus, which can sometimes be more diffuse, a wider focus. But as a result of that wider focus, it's more permeated by the mind wandering. And a lot of the mind wandering of the feminine is about thinking about other people. Yeah. And if you are a mum or a carer, you will have those things on your mind. And if there's a lot going on, it will pull the attention much more easily. So it's not about saying men are like this and women are like this. It's like, let's get curious about the different qualities of the attention, the interaction between the focus and what I've got on my mind, the differences between people in the ability to either shut that out and stay focused or manage it mindfully or choose to be lost in it. Yeah, choose to be lost in it.
A phrase I'm really loving that I've discovered, I think it might be to do with the Kaplan, the attention restoration theory, is soft fascination.
Ooh.
Come across that. I've seen that also in a few nature accessibility guides recently, and it relates to that, letting yourself be softly fascinated by something and that mind wandering. And in nature, particularly, that's quite important for certain types of minds and also for well-being, really, for anybody. Letting your attention be softly taken and fascinated, which I guess is the positive end of mind wandering again. And
Smallwood and Schooler had a paper which was something along the lines of not all wandering minds are lost.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Fantastic.
again, it's the detail seems important because, you can choose to mind wander. You can choose, but then it could be choosing to reflect, choosing to remember, choosing to create, choosing to have a kind of effort in the thinking, or the soft effort, which is the allowing. In meditation, we use the phrase alert, relaxed is the two dimensions.
That really worked for me.
Yeah.
In your videos, alert, relaxed, it's such a good thing to remember day to day.
The soft fascination, it's not exactly the same, but it's got a bit of a quality around it, and maybe soft fascination is a bit more on the relaxed end, isn't it? It's more allowing, but there's a consciousness to it.
Absolutely. And we spoke about in Joseph that it's maybe traditionally more masculine style of attention, Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. I'm going to go on this big journey as opposed to the heroine's journey, which maybe takes a different way round. And I mean, gender differences and gender fluidity are both things I'm looking at in my research. I've been reading a lot of Nan Shepherd, who's wrote The Living Mountain, and one of her big things, it's a beautiful book, one of her big things was that, men sort of to go for the peak and women are about the plateau, which is that could be interpreted as very sexist these days, but it's just an illustration of what we're saying, I think, is that whatever gender you are, there's a different way round into experience, which is something I think about researching disability arts. A lot of people who can't get to the peak. Being in nature, using that kind of attention, having those therapeutic experiences in the outdoors and the landscape requires an allowance of that soft attention, which might take you somewhere else completely.
Well, but it's combined with a willingness to be lost or to be led. It's combined with a willingness to allow the unexpected. Again, I'm thinking of the Brazil team. We have a colleague, Clarissa, and she's done some work with deep ecology at Schumacher College. She's done some training there, and then she kind of like mixing it with the mindfulness, but she almost exclusively now works with this natural environments and mindfulness. So if people can't get out, it includes, drawing the plants. So there's a lot of kind of creative arts present. What do you notice? Stay with. What do you notice? Turn the camera in. What's happening there? Turn the camera out. What do you see? And this interplay between it's funny because I want to say, the natural object, as if we were not part of the natural world, right? And I think that's often where her work takes her students, is this idea that we're not separate. Why do we think nature is the thing over there that is there to help us be mentally well? We are nature also. And it's a reciprocal, that's the 4E cognition piece for me. We're a reciprocal, dynamic interaction with this environment all the time. All the time.
And it's so, it's so different depending on what type of environment you're in, isn't it? And just a last point on the possible male and female differences. I think female conditioning really comes into that as women, and possibly our conditioning to be less assertive. And at times we need to take the hero's journey, or be the director focus and the assertiveness, which is, I think, very related to your sword sisters.
Yeah,
if you could say a little bit about them. I really want to about that.
And I think you're exactly right. In brief, and probably triggering a lot of people. in brief, what I sometimes invite people to explore is if you're in the masculine energy and you've got that hyper-focused attention, probably your growth edge to be balanced is to learn to soften and open. And what that sometimes looks like in the real world is be less selfish and more concerned about others. For the feminine, for the yin, again, it may not speak to you, but generalizing, it's possible that your growth edge is to sharpen and focus and care less what people think and slightly be more selfish.
I'm nodding.
You're nodding.
I am nodding.
Yes. And it's not to take it to extremes, and it's not, but if we think about how meditation was taught traditionally, I'm thinking about Buddhist context. These are predominantly, they start with focused attention practices in a very systematized and structured, very yang structured, lots of lists, a pathway designed by men for the male brain. But where are they heading? They're heading to compassion, aren't they? Yeah, they're heading to compassion. So it feels like, meet the mind where it's at, but they're aiming to get to that point of selflessness. Yeah, and they sit down, and before they sit down, they're like, for the benefit of all, for the benefit of all, for the benefit of all.
The greater good, the greater good.
Yeah, and I'm sort of flipping that, again, generalizing massively. But if we say, okay, but if it's reversed for women, yeah, maybe in many women, there's more of a preference, more of an inclination, to be more thoughtful about the next generation, the children, what's going to come, what is this going to look like, for the children, the offspring, the grandparent, the children of the children of the children, so already there's that orientation that's much broader and longer in terms of the time frame. But the gross task, and I think this is the gross task for women now, is a little bit coming into that fierce compassion, which is much more directive, much more targeted, much more, sorry, if your kid is going to put a finger into the electric socket, I am willing to be quite rough, right? I'm willing to be quite rough and quite brutal in that emergency moment, because there's something really big at stake. Mm-hmm. So I think my feeling is we're sort of in this moment now. I think if we went really big and transpersonal, the ball is rolling from the peak of the patriarchal. And so therefore, what is the task as the feminine rises? What's our task? And I think our task is to hold on to our compassion, our grounding, our earthing, but to slightly yang it up a bit in terms of really getting firm. Where do we want to put our energy? And I speak to a lot of women, particularly around things like AI, where the business world is going, technology sector. And it's just fascinating because, a lot of them are in those businesses, but they don't get the money. So it's just happening, right? 2% of venture capital goes to women, even though they've got great products. But then it's like, where are we putting our energy for the future?
Yeah, maybe that's, asserting the yin. And part of my research is ecofeminism, which is going to be a whole other podcast, several other podcasts, and building societies based on those networked, softer systems.
Yeah.
But still really directing that, which is say fierce compassion and like loving hard, like being really, really going in there. And not just mimicking the masculine. So I see a lot of women who have been strongly conditioned by the environments to act in a certain way. They're not even aware of it. And so with the sword work, the Sword Sisters program, we're inviting that exploration of how can I wield feminine power that comes from the heart, comes from a place of grounding, connected to energy and the natural energies of the universe. But, where do I want that energy down through the sword to be more directed and more yin? And it's really powerful. Yeah, it's quite a powerful experience for many of the women. Some people just want to get the sword and sort of, flash it around, but we do it in a semi sort of shamanic kind of, meditations, intention setting, really inviting it to be used as a meditation instrument. But I don't know if this speaks to all women, but certainly there's something about, women that are in places of impact and influence, whether it's because they've got money or they're in a senior leadership role. It's like, how do we bring the feminine energy? But I notice, even my own sister, when she was working in corporate, they were saying, do you want to go up the ladder into the C-suite? And she was like, but I don't want to work like that. No, it's awful. And this is where we can mention rest, I think. Rest and asserting a restful culture is deeply kind of feminist, I feel. And a desire lines, I've been naming these desire lines through my work, and rest is one of them. I'd just like to quote from Tricia Hersey's Rest is Resistance. So she says, there will be days when you will be pulled back into the system and you will find yourself spinning, dizzy with the effects of hyperproductivity. The work is to first gain deep awareness that the pace at which this culture is functioning is not normal or sustainable. This understanding offers an invitation for the collective pilgrimage we are on as we attempt to disrupt and push back against a system that has no pause button. Stay here for a while.
I need to get that book. I mean,
yes, it's great.
I mean, two things very much aligning with the work that I've done in mindfulness in motion, because chapter 1 of that book is basically about who chooses the pace of your life and utilizing even just micro pauses, or not even a pause, but just slowing down. Can I even just slow my pace or slow my speech? Like micro moments of taking charge of pacing, because then you're bringing back some agency. But it's very hard, particularly in those corporate environments. As you know, as she says, you get sucked back in. Everything's urgent, everything's important, everything's now.
And our agency slips away from us the more we're engaged in the attention economy as well. I could quote many lines from Jenny Adele's The Attention Economy, which How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy is a great book, which I'll put in the show notes as well. And we could really go into that. I'd like to sort of touch on maybe the desire for agency to start to draw us towards a close, because we've been speaking for, I think, an hour, but we could go on. I mean, I think there are multiple episodes in the future we could do for sure. So maybe for really really maybe craving a bit of agency within this culture, which is paradoxical, because in the Western world we've given too much agency, too much choice almost. And I wonder if we could go into the idea of desire. And I think we've explored the lines and pathways idea, but if we look at desire as a concept that's culturally interpreted really in our society as being kind of hedonistic, sensation seeking, whereas your work and going deeper into the brain's attention network, that they sort of direct us into really being aware of our deeper impulses and needs, and maybe the ones that are more surface level and the ones that aren't, that are really, really authentic. I wondered if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're going at that rapid speed and our attention has been hijacked, necessarily our intentions have been hijacked. I often use that language. I say our intentionality has been hijacked, which is why it's so groundbreaking for people when I offer them a transitional pause and I say, in part 3 of the transitional pause, that might be one of the exercises that I can share with your audience. It's a kind of a meditation. Part 3 is just set your intention for what you're going to do next. And it could be what you're going to do next, or it could be how you're going to approach. So you've got 2 places where you can set intention, and some people just blows their mind. Now, when you're talking about intentions, motivations, aspirations, desires, there's some nuance in the language there. But when we're looking at compassion practices, the instruction with the compassion practice is often using the language of desire rather than intention, which is interesting, because we say, I've got a deep, heartfelt desire for myself to be feeling safe and connected, for you to be feeling, I'm in my heart and I'm trying to muster this intention plus affect, intention plus the feeling of the heart, which is a deep, heartfelt desire for everyone to feel safe and protected, for everyone to move with ease and kindness, for everyone to find a place of contentment, me and you and everyone, the sort of classic loving kindness.
And desire, just to touch on, I mean, it's traditionally bad in Buddhism and lots of other practices and type. I mean, if we're talking about the more sort of hedonistic end, I suppose, but generally those desires, wants, needs, impulses are not looked upon favorably in many spiritual visions, where it's actually to say, I have a longing, it expresses something of the soul.
Well, it depends. Where's the root of the energy coming from? So desire in that more ego sense, it's probably not the heart, it's probably the head, right? Which is, I've got a desire for this thing because it's filling a void and because I'm addicted to the pleasure of it and I want the pleasure to keep going, versus the desire that maybe comes through the heart. And you could be entering into this transpersonal conversation there, that heartfelt desire where we're all connected, for all beings to be well, for all beings to feel safe, because we know how we act when we don't feel safe. We're a nightmare. We harm. We're angry. We prejudice. We're really seeing this now, right? People are scared and fearful, and they're acting like idiots, right? And very self-centered and unable to see the common humanity of our experience. So, but some of that, I think you use the words needs, which is interesting. Part of the process of becoming mindful is being able to identify, what do I need? Mm-hmm. And I remember the first time I was asked that question, I actually didn't even really understand what I was being asked. What do you need? What do you need right now?
I think so many of us don't really know how to identify that, even in this culture. And it maybe has a lot to do with conditioning as well, because it takes quite a lot to get to the deeper articulation of that. And I'm looking at Max Neef's human needs, and opposed to the like Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of thing. Saying like it's actually like still that's a hierarchy. it was useful, but it is a fairly basic hierarchy, and Max Neef did a lot more with it, but there's more. It's much more in that determining what people need. And like you say, actually those deeper desires that come through the heart are shared. They're not selfish. We will actually desire community and safety and healthy relationships and love and a sense of family, whether you had children or not, and harmony.
Well, and I suppose for listeners out there, that for me the first movement was discerning needs versus wants. And, again, a very deep question, but quite a novel one. Is it a need or is it a want? And, given, my situation, my karma, where I landed on this planet, what do I need? Well, in terms of material things, whenever I think, what do I need? I just go to kind of like, okay, my body is basically working. I can move, I can breathe, I can mostly take care of myself. It's amazing all that I have. I mean, wants, there's a whole bloody shopping list of things that I want. I still want a pony from like when I was about 5 years old. But what do I need? Sometimes that links a little bit to the gratitude practices sometimes for me, because we begin to see how much we have and how much of that angst and feeling of scarcity is mental activity. But I think, when I look at those more Buddhist practices, the loving kindness, it's, the words have been a bit adapted for use in the Western context, but it's often something, may I be safe and protected. May I be healthy. May I live with ease and kindness. It's not, may I be happy. It's not it. May I live with ease and kindness. And I've taken to signing off my emails, wishing you a day of ease and kindness.
Yes, it's somewhat more specific than happy, isn't it? Which is such a pressure.
Well, have a good day. Have a great day. Well, they may not be having a great day. It could be a really terrible day. So it's like, wishing you ease and kindness in your work and play today.
Oh, yeah. And that like toxic positivity thing, because you could be having an awful day, but you could still go for a little bit of ease and kindness for sure.
Yeah.
And there's just a couple of other things I wanted to touch on, I think, in terms of conditioning and those wants and desires. We spoke the other week about, being a bit brave with your choice of pathways as well, and maybe, living out some of those deeper desires once we've got in touch with them that maybe haven't been trodden by others in our families and our conditioned tribes. I feel that's quite a big point, potentially.
Well, I think, as you're saying that, the group I think the most of, I've worked quite a lot with medical students, and the number of medical students that have got parents who are doctors is just bonkers. And, many of them, it's not really what they want to do. And there's often some thwarted artistic geniuses in there who really wanted to go to art school, but ended up in medicine. And, how do we, I think it's tricky because when we're making some of those decisions, like what we want to study, our brains are still quite immature. And, we probably go a path that's kind of the least resistance, and somebody's doing a bit of nudging, and that's what everybody else is doing. And, before you know it, you're somewhere where you think, well, hang on a minute, how did I get here? And I suppose maybe an answer to that is go to university later, or try to really explore a bit before, if you've got the opportunity and the means. But when I'm in my therapy work, often the question I'm asking people is, what did that inner child, what did you just love as a kid? What did you just really love to do? Was it painting? Was it singing? Was it dancing? Was it, setting up a little lemonade stand with your friend next door? Was it, what did that inner child, what was the joy and the flow and the spark?
And even if we can bring those things alongside the other pathways we've chosen, even not everybody is going to or should jack in their careers and go do whatever, or go off piste like some of us. But just to allow a bit more of that.
To nurture it and to nourish it, and you just don't know. Very often there is something in there that there is something in there where you just think, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
That passion and purpose that we've spoken about before. You likened that in our previous conversation to the chi energy that wants to express through us. Maybe we could speak a little bit about that to end the conversation.
Well, I'm in this mode myself, just having turned 50, so I've gone quite, reflective on my own journey.
Yeah, look it.
And that's often a moment, isn't it, when you're like, oh God, sort of years are clocking down rather than clocking up. So you get a bit more serious about what am I doing and why am I doing it. And I have to say, I look back and I just think I haven't got regrets. There are things that I kind of wanted, or I needed, or I thought I wanted and needed, but in the reality, what I wanted and needed was to keep exploring. I just know that is the thing that I love, and it's through conversations with people, it's through working in different environments, different cultures, it's endless creating. And it's had some kind of quote unquote costs in terms of being able to fit in and be understood in a mainstream world. I know there are lots of people that look at me and go, but what do you actually do? I can't understand. You're talking about Kung Fu 1 minute, and then you're talking about psychology, then you're talking about the business world, then you're talking about, chickens. All your chicken project that you're doing, I can't keep up,
I also have that. And I touch in with people I haven't, spoken to for a while, and I go, what is she doing now?
Well, exactly. The slightly little digs, isn't it? Like, oh, it's so interesting.
Started to enjoy it. Yeah, it's just quite fun.
But then I'm like, what's the thread? What's the thread? And for me, the thread is I want to live and explore. And
there is a William Stafford poem I love, which I'll post in the notes as well, which is like, there's a red thread you follow, and it's about following this red thread. And I mean, the last line, I can't recite it, but the last line is, you don't ever let go of the thread.
Yeah.
I mean, we could talk, I think, all night. This is possibly already an hour. I'll do a little bit of editing, but you know, it's all such great material. I wondered if we could end the conversation for now, because I think we'll pick this up in the future. What is a desire line that is speaking to you right now to explore?
I think the one for me that I'm still exploring is, it's not a thing, it's a psychological thing. I'm really exploring this edge between impulsivity and choice. Because people often say to me, like, oh, you're really brave. And then I sometimes think, I don't think I'm brave. I think I'm really impulsive. And I've got some good coping skills so I can manage. So I'm exploring, like, what is choice and bravery? So, and I think it's that bit that I spoke at the beginning, which is, how can I use the energy of the impulsivity? Maybe I go to the sword, right? More wisely, more directed, but including with that bravery, like really be brave rather than impulsive.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yes, it's a great project.
Great. And for bearing with a couple of technical hitches, but you know, we're all learning, aren't we? That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to everybody for listening to Desire Lines. I hope to see you listening to future episodes, and do get in touch if you have any questions about today or would like to make contact. Can I point you towards the podcast Instagram, which is @DesireLinesPodcast, and to Tamara's links and events and all the references we've mentioned in the show notes as well.